Hello, and welcome to Kevin's educational podcast, run and mediated by Kevin Faist, that is me, pronouns he, him, his, thank you, and let's get started. Never laugh. No, like, you're having fun.
Kevin's Educational Podcast.
So today I have two special guests, and I will let them introduce themselves, starting with the one to the far right.
Alright, hi, I'm Avery Jones. I use any pronouns. I am a first year at the University of Richmond. I'm currently undecided on my major, but likely going into biology. And fun fact about myself is I like sharks.
Alright, hi, I'm Surya, Dodia. I'm a first year political science student at the University of Florida. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And a fun fact about me is that I am a spelling bee champion.
Oh, that's cool. Now, what we want to talk about today is I recently underwent the course titled Intro to Education. Now, this course taught me a lot about the issues in the education system. I didn't realize how systemically flawed our education system was as a whole and all of the stuff going on in the background or the foundation of what it was placed on. So that is what we're going to be having a conversation about today. Alright, so I'd like to just get right into it. Is that good with you guys?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so I'd like to start with asking you guys, what's your guys' definition of education?
You want to start?
I guess to me, like, education, when I first think of the word, I think school, I think classrooms, I think about my childhood and the way that I went to school and what I enjoyed most about it. So my relationship with my teachers, with my other classmates, really just a sense of community. To me, education is about community and people coming together to create an environment where a child can learn and grow.
Yeah, mine's definitely very similar. I think when you say the word education, the first thing that comes to mind is just learning in general. But then education more defined and like how it's been throughout my life is more systematically present, where it's more like you're going to this location to learn, you're going to do these things to learn and become educated.
So would you guys say education can happen anywhere?
I would think so, yeah. Yes and no.
Some sort, yeah.
Yeah, in different forms, yes.
I think it's all about too, like, what you consider to be education as well, because there are some things that you don't even realize you're learning when you're there. So a lot of that, I think a good example is traveling. A lot of people travel, they might just consider it vacation, but you don't realize how much you're really learning just from simply being in that place. Simply being in an area that you're not familiar with, I think, is education in a way, because you're teaching yourself something that you didn't know before.
Yeah, I think there's definitely different types of education, and like as you mentioned, like exposure to different cultures, different environments is certainly a form of education that we probably think about less compared to like the more like go and sit in a classroom and have someone teach you very specific topics.
Perfect. I agree with you guys completely. I think that education can happen in any environment, even when you're not noticing it. Like, even when you're just playing games outside with your friends, you're still learning about the people you're around. You're learning about how people react in different situations, in different games. You're learning about how yourself would react to certain occurrences in nature and stuff. Just whatever you're doing can be interpreted as education in some sort. So the definition that I think we've come to is that anything can be education anywhere. It just doesn't have to, it's not limited to the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So now I think we kind of covered this already. I was going to talk about what is the purposes of education. And I think you guys pretty much summed it up in that it's anything you learn and it can build one's character. Do you guys have anything to add about that?
I think education is also a way to make you not a more like competitive or like competent individual, but just a more well-rounded person. I think that education, if we don't limit it just to, the common core curriculum, math, science, reading, writing, if you expand education beyond things like that into the more, like you said, just being outside with your friends and, learning about other people, I think that education makes you a better person in that sense, and that it makes you more well-rounded. It makes you better at understanding other people rather than understanding, other topics or things that, are hard to comprehend. I think learning about people is the same as, any sort of education. So it makes you a more well-rounded person.
Yeah, and like beyond it making you like a well-rounded person, it also just like helps you to better make decisions within your life. I mean, you can't really make like informed decisions if someone has not educated you on like how to make informed decisions and like what you need to know before going out to make decisions. Not even when it comes to like political activism or like certain things, but even just like life skills.
Yeah, you can turn basically any experience you have into a learning opportunity, right? Okay, so now I'd like to go into what our educational system is founded on, and one popular theory that seems to be like most people surround their view of education on and what its purpose is in the community. So the popular theory that I've learned about throughout this course, and that it seems to keep coming up whenever I think about it, is the human capital theory of education. And what the human capital theory is the popular belief of what the human capital theory is that through educating its citizens, a society creates a variety of different able-bodied workers of all social classes to hold jobs and contribute to a healthy economy. And that is given to me by Gillies in his source, The Human Capital Theory in Education. Now, it sounds good on paper, right? It just sounds like people are learning to build a better economy. What do you guys think about this theory?
I think like you mentioned, like in concept, the theory is really nicely placed and like definitely necessary. You can't have an economy and a government being based upon like the rights of the people and what the people want without ensuring that those people are educated to make decisions and know what's going to happen. But at the same time, I think education goes beyond just what we're contributing to like society around us. I had a teacher in my seminar class that I took this past semester who basically, at some point during it, asked us like, "Why are you at college?" And the general answer for most people was like, "I'm here to learn." And I think there's a lot more to education than just becoming educated to like add to society. And there's a huge part of education is just wanting to learn and wanting to know more. Like curiosity plays a huge role in education, like enjoying learning new things.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was just gonna say, like, I feel like theories like that too are kind of the reason why we see such like a divide between STEM majors and humanities majors. There seems to be a growing culture of kind of an anti-humanities and anti-liberal arts, movement going on because of theories like that.
Mm-hmm.
There's like this misconception that only STEM majors of doctors and engineers are productive members of society and are worthwhile majors to pursue because they contribute to very, feasible careers in the future. But I think it's kind of overlooked how, when we are there to learn and we are there to have that curiosity, you can give life to so many different types of careers. And I think it's also overlooked a lot of the times too. There's this misconception about specifically college education that you don't have to be a specific major or one or the other to have a certain career. I know that like history majors are one of the top percentages of like law school applicants that go on to become lawyers and politicians and other types of government workers. So, and if you really think about that, it makes sense because it's teaching you these critical thinking skills that require a lot of writing and reading that you wouldn't normally think of if you're thinking about, a biology major who's obviously going to go on to be a doctor.
Yeah.
So I think that theories like that kind of create misconceptions about the value of certain studies and the way that can, translate into different careers. So to me, theories like that are kind of outdated, but still worth, investigating to see if they, hold any weight going down the line.
I completely agree with both of you said. Obviously, we need workers to go through the education system in order to have a healthy economy, but at the same time, it does create issues in it kind of places people into certain groups and what they're going based on education. Also, income plays a big role in this theory because in poorer neighborhoods, it is shown that a lot of them go on to be blue-collar workers and don't go to college and have less opportunity because they are in a low-income neighborhood or their parents don't make as much money as, say, someone in Naples, Florida, the community we grew up in, where most of the kids from our high school did end up going to college and are going to pursue STEM careers or political science careers, law careers, doctors, whatever. And I think that we were just set up, fortunately, to be able to easily go into these fields because of what kind of income we make, our parents made, and where we are in general.
Yeah.
So I think that's the main issue with the human capital theory. Do you guys have anything to add about that?
I mean, I think it also has a lot to do, like, if you go back down to just, like, the basic level of, like, elementary school. I mean, there are, even though they're all in the same county, there's a huge divide between a lot of the elementary schools in Collier County specifically. And as you move up from elementary to middle to high school, you can see those divides even more. Like, Immokalee High School right down the road from Gulf Coast are in completely different, like, tax brackets. And it's really disturbing sometimes to see how kids who grew up right down the road from each other are going to have very different outcomes in life simply based on, you know, how much money their parents were able to make and how much, you know, they were able to invest in their opportunities as a kid. And that's really unfortunate. But, and it's not, you know, oh, that's just how things are, but in Collier County specifically, which, you know, as you mentioned, is a pretty wealthy county, those divides still exist. And, you know, it's kind of the reason why we see a lot of this, you know, divide between the haves and the have-nots in terms of education.
No, I 100% agree. I didn't grow up going to elementary school, and I went to middle school in Collier County for 1 year. But even in like the county that I was in previously, we still saw all those divides. And even at the school the college that I go to now, like everyone is obviously there, and everyone's worked their way to get there. But it's still, you see a vast difference in the way that people have learned based upon where they have grown up and what they've experienced and what they've been taught, and it impacts like people differently in the classroom. Whereas like some people learn slower than others, not because they actually do it, because that's what they've been, like that's how the education system that they've been set into, based upon the county that they lived in and the location they lived in and their parents' income has like trained them to learn.
Very well said. So I think that I was gonna ask if you guys had any solutions, but I think we've come to the conclusion that this theory does fundamentally, like just looking at it as just baseline, yes, it's true, but there's so much more that needs to be taken into consideration when we're looking at the like fluid definition that education truly is.
What did you say that theory's from?
It's just a educational theory that's been widely accepted. It came about I think a couple decades ago.
Okay.
And it's just like what big government and federal government has seen education as, and that's what a lot of people have accepted education to be in recent years. But with the upcoming Gen Z, I do foresee a big reform coming, which I think is needed. With us being more educated on these topics and us seeing the issues within education and classes like this pointing out all the issues, it can, I mean, obviously information and being informed is key to reform. And I think Gen Z is doing a very good job of informing themselves and getting involved in issues, even if everyone's like not giving us the credit that I think we deserve.
I think it's really interesting. Like we're already seeing things change. I think COVID made like a big impact on that. Like multiple of my friends at school never submitted their test scores because they simply didn't need to. It was never a requirement. So it was purely based off of like the effort that they put into their grades and their learning, and not just them sitting down in a 4-hour period and just doing as much as a test as they could.
And I completely agree, and that brings up my next topic very nicely. Standardization. We are seeing it phased out, but it is still a large part of like elementary, middle, high school education. Standardization, standardized tests like the SAT, ACT. We saw the FCAT years ago, but now we see the FSA. It's always been there, and we've just come to be like, oh, it's just a test. But it's so much bigger than just a test. People see your scores, they don't see you. And I think that adds into the human capital theory as well. And my question to you guys is, what level of standardization, or if any at all, is necessary in education?
I mean, honestly, like I kind of agree, like the whole SAT, ACT thing has kind of become obsolete, you know, because when you're applying to college and you are basically an adult at that point, they should be looking more at, you know, your learning capabilities and what you've done to kind of shape your own career, what you want to do. Because obviously, like for example, like I wanted to do political science in college, so why would I, you know, excel in math or things like that? But then again, when we look at standardized testing at the elementary school level, I do think it is necessary to have standardized tests just simply for benchmarking kids and creating kind of a foundation for them to learn. Because while it is, you know, a stressful situation to, you know, take a standardized test like that, I do think it is necessary just to keep track of, a child's ability to learn how to read, how to do basic math, because those are things that are necessary regardless of what, they want to pursue later on in life. And unfortunately with COVID, there's, been studies about declines in children's reading capabilities because they're not in the same classroom environment, and they're stuck at home, and it's left up to parents to try to piece together these, reading skills and math skills, and they're not educators, they're not trained to do those sorts of things. So I think standardized testing does come in handy with younger kids and just kind of providing benchmarks, in order to keep them on the right track. But once you get older, I think standardized testing should kind of be phased out.
No, I entirely agree. I think that standardized tests from a young age are, like you mentioned, a really good way to ensure that not only kids are falling on track and can get additional help if they need it, but that all kids are being educated fairly and equally. And it also allows teachers to cater to students that might need more assistance or might need less assistance or learn in different ways. But other than that, standardized testing throughout my life has always been a massive stressor, and something that I did not find aided my education. When I moved from Northern Virginia to Florida right when I was starting my 8th grade, and essentially I wanted to take what was considered Cambridge classes in our middle school, and because I did not have Florida test scores, they would not allow me to take those classes, even though all of the other classes I was taking I found extremely easy and was bored the entire time. So I even found standardized testing to be something that was holding me back from learning more. And beyond that, I don't think grades as a whole, and that kind of relates to standardized testing, really show someone's ability to learn. If you were to have a student who, let's say you have 3 tests throughout the semester and they get a B, a B, a B, you can see that, they started off with a B and they continued and they kept that up. But if you have a student who started on the first test and got a C and then moved up to a B minus and then got it up in the last one they got an A minus, which one learned more? Despite the fact that person's average for a grade is going to be lower because they got lower test scores overall.
I do agree. I think that standardized testing is less of judging a person's ability to learn and more of judging a person's ability to memorize, especially with standardized tests such as the ACT and the SAT, because I know that you went through this, I know you went through this, when we were looking at past SATs or even PSATs before that, we saw patterns in the types of questions they would ask. It was kind of just like you were working out a formula, and it was you just have to learn how to do it. You don't have to learn the information taught. That's just the baseline. You have to learn the specific questions and how to do these things to get the right answer, not through any way that you know, just through a way that's been taught to you and how to just answer these questions.
I think 70% of my preparation for the SAT was just going through and not understanding what the question was asking and then memorizing, okay, what order are the texts in the writing section going to be? How is the progression of the math going to go? What percentages of this is going to be algebra compared to something else? And these are the 4 formulas that I just have to memorize that I'm probably not going to use again in my life.
Well, yeah, no, it's the whole aspect of super scoring your SAT scores. It's you can do super well in the math section and then horribly on the reading, but it's fine because on the last test you took, it cancels out. And so I remember I took the SAT I think 5 times, and I just super scored and I got a good score, but it wasn't because I did one test really well. It's because I had to take it 5 times until I could piece 2 different sections together and make it work. But to me, that just doesn't seem indicative of how I succeed in college at all, because in college I don't do anything related to what was on that test at all, ever. I do, most of my assignments involve writing, involve public speaking, involve, networking and things like that, and there's nothing on the SAT that reflects that at all. And I think it's kind of bogus that we kind of continue to think that the SAT or ACT is about, critical thinking skills or time management, because it's really not.
If you were to give me an SAT right now, I would do significantly worse than I would have done after I'd studied for months for it, simply because I'm not familiar with the format of it.
One of you brought up a really good point about how you've studied and you know the format and you super score and stuff. So now that we're on the topic of standardization and standards, we know that governments create the standards, which inherently politicizes school and educational environments. To what extent should federal government have in making these standards, and if at all? Because personally, I think that of course there's baselines that you want to meet for everyone under your in society. You want everyone to know the same basic information,
Mm-hmm.
but how far should you go to tell like teachers what they should be learning, how they should teach it? Because we see a lot less teacher autonomy nowadays because of how strict these guidelines are.
I think there's a very fine line because in states, especially like Florida, there's this, kind of like leave it to the parents rhetoric, but that's not really in a beneficial way. It's in a way to reference, not teaching your kids about Black History Month in schools. It's about not teaching your kids about different sexualities in schools. And so this whole like leave it to the parents idea is really rooted in very harmful, generally conservative ideologies. But then again, it's hard because on the flip side, when you have too much, government control over the classroom, then you're creating, kind of a too strict of a, restraint for the teacher in order to have freedom with the kids to teach them based on what they feel is most appropriate at the time. So I think that there has to be this line between creating standards that are set by the federal government, but also allowing the teacher to use those standards to their discretion and based on what they feel the kids are ready for at the time. Because while yes, kindergarten through third graders probably aren't learning about sexuality anyway, taking away the opportunity for that entirely is really harmful because it can create very dangerous environments for kids who might have, say same-sex parents, or a teacher who might have a partner rather than a husband or a wife. And I think that, allowing just conversations to exist without being, subject to these laws is important. So.
No, I 100% agree. I think that fine line that you were talking about is based a lot around fear. Teachers are very scared to say certain things in the classroom because it gets them in a lot of trouble. And I also think that, and you kind of touched on this, but there's so much more to what is being learned in the classroom than what is written by the government's curriculum. There's social skills aspects of it, there's communication aspects, there's learning what you actually enjoy and learning how to actually enjoy learning and curiosity. And it's very difficult to write that into a set of standards that you want everyone to learn. There needs to be an aspect of this that teachers can be able to say, I can see that this student is struggling because they learn in a different way, and I want to be able to help them without being afraid of losing my job, or crossing a boundary that the government has laid out, stating that I'm only supposed to be teaching these things.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So when teachers have these strict bindings on them, we have seen a complete breakdown of a lot of school systems because of teachers leaving or teachers striking. Specifically in Ohio, there was a strike recently because teachers weren't getting enough funding, not because they weren't getting paid enough, but because they couldn't provide the tools in their own classroom. They couldn't work to the fullest extent because they weren't getting funding.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw these strikes, and some people see teacher strikes as very harmful, and in some ways they can be. But when they're not usually seen as, like, they're not just like, oh, we don't like what's happening, we strike. It's, according to this article by Zachary Wolf, who works for CNN, teachers don't want to strike because it ends up hurting the children's education, but in the end they have no other choice. Because striking is ultimately a last resort technique, there are many downfalls for all parties involved: teachers, parents, students, and administration. And because it's such a last resort, not a lot of people like that because it is so drastic. When teachers strike, there's no one to teach, and admin has to step in. But to what extent is that necessary for reform to be made? I think that's the issue that's really happening right now in places like Ohio and down here in Florida, where there are very strict guidelines and low funding in some areas.
Mm-hmm.
How do you guys feel about teacher strikes?
I completely agree with everything that you just mentioned, where it's that fine line of not knowing exactly what to do, but teachers' jobs are hard. I would not be the person that I am today without every single teacher that's been in my life who has helped shape me into who I am now. And you need to take into consideration that you become a teacher because you want to help kids learn, or you want to help students learn. You want to help shape them and better them and help them get be successful in life. So then there is that line of having to go into consideration of, is this this strike that I'm going to go on going to further benefit or harm kids? And that's, I think, is like the main question, and I don't think I know how to answer that.
Well, I think it's just kind of like funny how we look at teacher strikes as this like new and novel thing, as if it's something that's like this crazy outburst, when historically labor strikes have been around forever, and they've generally been effective because it, exposes harmful working conditions or, unfair labor laws and things like that. So I think if we started looking at teachers as, those valuable laborers that they are, because essentially that is what they are, then we might start taking them a little bit more seriously and stop blaming them for their own, downfalls, because it's not a teacher's fault if, they're underfunded and, they're not able to teach their kids correctly when there's all these higher ups that are having more say in the matter than they should. So to me, I think teacher strikes I think they are necessary, because I'm not one to say that, violence is never the answer or riots are never the answer, because sometimes it is. Like, when you are at that point where you just have nothing left to do and there's nothing else you can say to get anyone's attention, a strike is necessary. And while yes, like that can negatively affect children in the short term, I think that it serves a better purpose in the long term, because it starts to call attention to some severe issues.
I also feel like news coverage and media of like teacher strikes definitely presents it as like, oh, these teachers are like turning and going against our children's education, when you have to consider that this is their jobs. This is what they have devoted their life to and what they have gone to school and invested a lot of money to become, and that it's well thought out and it is a last resort. And it's something that deserves to be listened to.
Yeah, no teacher wants to go on a strike.
No one wants to lose their job.
No one wants to have to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what people are overlooking. People are thinking like, oh, teachers are being selfish. No, they feel so bad when they have to resort to this, because they care so much about their job and how much they know it'll affect their students. And that's the like mental issues that like teachers have in their heads, because it's like, no matter what I do with this teacher strike, I am going to hurt some child's education.
Yep.
I am not giving them the full opportunity that they deserve as a child in the education system. But at the same time, this is my life too, and my profession is to make sure these students have enough opportunity. So if I'm not getting my basic rights and my basic opportunities, how am I going to allow these kids to do it in an educational setting? And I think that's just the bottom line of teacher strikes. I think they're necessary, but they are last resorts, and I think people need to look more into it before they start blaming teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're gonna look into the big debate that's arisen: equality versus equity. Now, are you familiar with the definitions of both of these words?
Yes.
So, for anyone that doesn't know, equality is everyone should be given the same opportunity baseline. Everyone is getting equal rights. Everyone just gets the same things. Equity is more fluid. It's if someone is in a lower income society, they should be given more things than a higher income society, because they're born with less, or they are in a worse off situation than someone with high income. So someone in a poor funded school is granted free lunch or free SATs, or just basic rights that some low income communities that we see in America don't have. And they're given more and they're funded higher because these high funded schools and these high income communities already have these things.
Mm-hmm.
But then you see the issue where these high income communities see more attention being given to these students. They're like, well, why aren't my students getting this much attention? And it's like, well, because you already have everything that they don't.
Mm-hmm.
But people see that as unfair. So sometimes people see equity as unfair. People love equality. People love to say, oh, well, everyone's equal, so it's fine. But that's like the tip of the iceberg for what the actual issues in America. So what do you guys think about equity and equality?
I think the way you just put it, where like everyone's equal, so it's fine, doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is equal. I always believe in equity over equality. One of my favorite graphics, I don't know if you've seen it, is the picture of the people sitting at a fence, behind a fence, watching. I think it's like a baseball game or something, and it's like a picture. It's like equality, and it's everyone standing there, and it's someone who's taller who can see over the fence, and someone who's a little bit shorter than that, who can kind of see into the cracks, and there's a person in a wheelchair who's sitting and can't see any of the game. And then it's equity, where it's a chain link fence where everyone can see through. And I think we need to consider that to allow people to learn to the same degree, not all students are the same. Not all students are going to require the exact same amount of attention or resources, or like you mentioned when it comes to like income. That isn't necessarily what determines equality compared to equity.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think equity is much more important in addressing the problems that we have today as a society, because a lot of it is stemming from, income-related issues, and then that, connects to race-related issues and things like that. And so it's important to recognize that those factors are really hindering, a child's performance in school, and then their ability to have opportunities going forward. And so I think a really good example is like affirmative action, the way that that's used in the education system. That concept gets a lot of hate because it's like, okay, well, that's super unfair to everybody else that's, not black or Hispanic. But then when you look at it, it's, well, most kids who are disadvantaged in the college admissions process are coming from predominantly black and Hispanic communities. So obviously they're going to need that leg up that, other students don't. And there's also this misconception that it's, only white kids who don't get, the advantage or whatever, but it's Asian students as well. So I think, you can recognize that certain demographics don't typically need certain, opportunities that others do. And so it's like, I would never look at someone that goes to my school and be like, oh, you're black and you're only here because of affirmative action. It's like you can recognize that maybe somebody who came from a less advantaged situation than you needs a little bit more resources than you ever did. And it's like nobody would want to live like that. No one wants to have to rely on resources, but it's like the same with the teacher strikes. It's like that's all you have. That's the only choice you have. And so I think it's really selfish of people sometimes to think that equality is the only answer.
Mm-hmm. I feel like equality and equity goes so much deeper than just the idea that, oh, we're just going to give everyone the exact same resources. You need to consider that when you do that systematically, based off of how society is laid out and how different races are being treated, and like pretty much everything you were talking about, systematically, when you give everyone the exact same resources, it's still not equal. That's not gonna give everyone an equal leg up.
I agree. I think the argument, everyone hears like equal opportunity and they're like, oh yeah, that sounds great. But when you say equity, they're kind of similar. It's like equity versus equality is synonymous to equal opportunity versus equality. But when people hear equity, it's like, oh no. But then it's like, it's the same thing. So what's the issue?
Like equality doesn't equal equity, but equity leads to equality.
Yeah, exactly. Now, when you talk about equity and equality, you have to talk about funding.
Mm-hmm.
And funding is this big issue that everyone doesn't want to talk about because money's scary and funding's scary. But it's actually really sad when you think about school funding and how it actually is broken up. So I have a source here. It is Why America's Schools Have a Money Problem, written by Turner. It is an article. And he breaks down a school's funding based on averages across the United States. So in the United States, on average, a school's funding is coming from 45% locally, 45% from the state, and 10% from the federal government. So 55% of that is split equally among everyone, because it's 45% from state and 10% from federal. You can look at more wealthy states, but on average, it's still everyone in the state is getting the same amount from the state. Now, but you look at the 45% local. That is almost half of a school's income or a county's income coming from property taxes. And in lower income or rural or stuff like that, where there is not as much disposable income and people don't have these big houses in Port Royal and Naples, Florida, stuff like that, they don't have as much funding because of this breakup of where the money comes from. Now, with the equity issue it leads right into that. Inequity springs from a school's funding and where it comes from. So if you're in a lower income community, that 45% of your funding for your school completely depends on the area you're in and how much people make.
I mean, honestly, I think that's one of the reasons why we can see the huge divide between like Immokalee High School and then, Gulf Coast High School. Even though they're both in Collier County, counties are divided up even further into districts. So I believe Collier County is District 5. And, when you like vote on the ballot, you'll see like, okay, voting for District 5. And then that's, broken up between just a few schools in that district. But when you see that, Collier County, okay, yeah, like it's a rich county, but then there's still schools in there that are not receiving funding. You realize it's further down on a smaller level, at the district level, because you have people who are concentrated living into one area, like Port Royal, who are alumni of these schools or are funding these mega private schools like First Baptist and Community School. And they're neglecting places like Immokalee and all those elementary schools out there as well. And it's sad because, it's like there isn't much you can do about that unless you start to really redefine our voting districts and the way that, we align schools within, each, like you said, like property tax bracket. So I think to solve a problem like that involves severe, like, political disrupt.
No, I completely agree. I also think it's insane that the high schools that we went to are so vastly different to a high school that's 45 minutes away, simply because we live closer to $15 million homes. And we also live in a location where people come to retire. They make a lot of money throughout their entire lives and they come and they settle down, and that contributes to the schools we go to. And then I had the same experience before I moved to this county when I lived in Northern Virginia, because the city that I lived in was right next to Arlington, which was a much larger city, whereas people who lived out in like Alexandria and Great Falls, where it's much more spread out, their schools are going to be entirely different. Pretty much the same experience before I moved to Florida, in the sense that the city the town that I lived in was right next to Arlington, a bigger city, whereas schools out in Alexandria or Great Falls, despite the fact that the district is giving us the exact same, like, this is exactly what you should be teaching your students, are so vastly different. And I think I agree with you with like the only way to fix that is politics.
And that's what's sad with how it is right now. It's everything about school, everything that has to do with money has to do with politics, when it should be just like baseline. Every kid deserves the right to a good education and an equal education. That's what America is built on. It's built on equal opportunity, but people are just throwing that aside and being like, oh, equality. Although it's similar, equal opportunity is so much more complex when you think about it. And in these places that have less funding and in these places that are more rural, you really start to see the differences that a tax bracket can make, or a district you go to can make. Like you said, Immokalee. We see Immokalee and we think, oh, they have the poorer funded school. But if they were just given, if some things were changed, even like small changes, that can drastically change how a kid is brought up in Immokalee and even try to make it just a little bit more like how if we're raised in Collier County.
If people just started relocating to Immokalee instead of Port Royal and downtown Naples, you would immediately see a drastic difference. Simply because people who have nothing to do with the school whatsoever just moved there.
Exactly. And I want to move to both of these, equality versus equity and school funding issue, go right into COVID, because we saw different schools in different school districts react and come back from COVID very differently. Now, one specific article really caught my eye, and they were focused on a specific place in, I think it was Michigan. I will correct that if it's not Michigan. A specific place in Michigan, and it was two different districts, but one was highly funded, one was lowly funded. And it said, although federal programs were put in place to attempt to relieve some school districts, it has been shown that 70% of students live in districts where federal relief is inadequate for the learning lost due to the pandemic. And this is particularly painful because in these areas, standardized test scores are predicted to drop significantly, and teenage pregnancy and crime are predicted to rise. So because COVID in reality shut everything down for basically a whole year and a half, right? We saw this learning loss. And in places like Collier County, like we were able to do online. Everyone had a computer. Everyone was given a computer. We could easily just do online, even though we might not have had the same experiences in classroom. We still had the resources to work through
You were
this
able to
pandemic.
learn.
In other places, like the 70% of districts in this area, the federal government was not their friend. It did not provide enough relief in order for them to learn, and now we see students who could have grown up to be these amazing people that could change the world fall because of a pandemic that was completely out of their control. And I just think that that's a complete issue that leads to us needing to reform based on equity instead of equality.
Absolutely.
I mean, yeah, that's kind of like going back to like what I was talking about, how like reading scores are going down a lot with kids, especially because of the pandemic, because you know they were forced to be at home in an environment where parents were trying to play the role of teacher without any actual training, while also trying to manage their own careers. And I think that created a lot of problems, especially with younger students, because those are very formative years of your life in terms of, you know, the things that you learn. You know, learning how to read, learning how to do basic math, those are all things that you learn, you know, in elementary school. And it's hard to do that when you're sitting at home on a computer or just sitting at home in general if you don't have access to a computer. And I think it's hard for kids to jump back into that once, you know, schools opened up again and the classrooms opened up again, even with masks. I think it's hard for kids to adjust. You know, let's say a kid went through the pandemic, it started when they were in kindergarten, and they go back to school and by this time they're in second grade. You know, that's a huge leap for a kid developmentally, and I think that, you know, created a lot of challenges for them, you know, education-wise in terms of getting back on track.
I think that COVID definitely shows how big of a aspect that communication skills and social skills, and from a developmental standpoint, how important school is, like you were talking about. And like you were saying, like there's kids who fall behind at no fault of their own because of the way that the system is set up, and it's inappropriate. It shouldn't be happening.
It's completely devastating to see these kids that could have had bright futures just immediately. Like, obviously, you can come back, but it just makes it so much harder. Moving on to a less sad topic. I want to look at classroom reform. I have personally seen in recent years a lot more people taking up roles in special education and wanting to become special education teachers because you see the disadvantage these kids are at. And of course we're moving forward with that, and we are providing some opportunity, but I feel like a lot more can be done with special education and how we deal with it and how we can incorporate it in the classroom setting. And a rising theory is this theory of, or this solution of what's called inclusive education. Now, according to McManus in an article titled Inclusive Education Definition, Examples, and Classroom Strategies, he says that inclusive education is when all students, regardless of any challenges they may have, are placed in age-appropriate general education classes that are in their own neighborhood schools to receive high-quality instruction, interventions, and support that enable them to meet success in the core curriculum. Now, I think that this is a good solution to giving everyone equal opportunity and allowing special education students to interact with other students that may not have these disabilities. And I would like to know your guys' thoughts on the thought of inclusive education.
I really enjoy inclusive education. I feel like it's a great way to bring equity into the picture of education as a whole, for students who have disabilities, whether that be a physical disability or a mental disability. And it really it allows for, there's a big missing discourse for students who have special needs when it comes from a developmental and social and communicational standpoint. You need to consider that, yes, they need more assistance and they need a different style of learning, which is entirely necessary, but doing that does leave them out of a large aspect of what school is helping you to develop. And by using inclusive education, that helps provide that or fix that problem.
I'm not too familiar with the way that we structure special needs education presently. I know that in my experience it's been a lot of there is a specific group of students that have special needs, and they have their own schedule throughout the day, they have their own teacher and their own classroom, and they integrate with the other students, during social events or other types of programs. I think in terms of inclusive education and what that brings, I think it's a really positive outlook on, how we should start to include people from all different types of, standpoints into the classroom. But I will say, however, I think that when it comes to like elementary education, there is something to be said for, when you have a student with special needs in the classroom amongst a bunch of other, kids, I think that it could be hard for a teacher to manage a classroom full of all these kids while also providing those, separate needs for that student. I know in my experience, I've had a few, special needs kids in my classes before, for trial periods or just for certain points throughout the year. And there definitely was a different, there definitely was a harder dynamic to the teaching process when it came to the classroom. A lot of attention was often given to that student with special needs, not, to any fault of their own, but that's just because what they required as a student. And so I think that when it comes to like the very young, elementary age, I think that separate sort of, special needs education is appropriate. But then as you're getting into middle school, high school, where those social skills really need to start to come to life, I think that's when that inclusive education can kind of start to play out more fully.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I feel like that kind of leads to like maybe that teachers should be given more education on how to educate kids across a wider spectrum. And I also think it's kind of going back to one of my original points. I think it's very good for kids to be around lots of diversity, lots of different kinds of people, because if you are educated and exposed from a very young age, it leads to people being less ignorant and less afraid to ask questions later on.
Yeah, and I think that this idea of inclusive education, I completely agree with what you said. It does have a harder dynamic. I think that the background of this theory and of this strategy is pure. I think that it is very nice, and I think it's a very nice concept. But like you said, it is very hard to move forward if teachers are not given the appropriate education to deal with these certain situations. And it's just like, how much are we going to put on teachers, like in general, before they buckle and break? And I think we've seen that a lot. But going back to inclusive education, it is pure of heart, and it's a very nice idea that we have students with disabilities, students without disabilities, different races, different sexualities, all melting together, because I think that's what our society is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back to what we started this whole conversation with, which is learning comes from every situation. People think that some people think that children just go to school, they learn about the basic topics, they go home. No, it's like you see all these different people that live in your community. It's not just you and your family. It's or your community that may be predominantly white or predominantly black. You see all these people from different backgrounds, people with disabilities, people different backgrounds than you, and you learn from these people and you interact with these people, which isn't what people think that school is for, but it is a big part of the school system. And I think that's what's beautiful about the American school system at the moment. If we're looking at positives, we've been talking about negatives this whole time. I think that everyone coming together in public school or in private school, if that's what you prefer, is awesome. And you learn about these different people. I would have never met a lot of my friends if it weren't for school in general. Like, everyone's friend group is based around who they went to school with. And I think that's what's cool about school and even college. Like, now you see these people that came from different schools and you're like, wow.
Well, I think that's one of the really beautiful things about public school in particular, because, I kind of have a particular bone to pick with like private schools in already wealthy counties, because then you're really just perpetuating this, kind of just like exclusive group of, rich kids. Whereas I think public schools, you'll meet kids from, areas of town that you probably never even heard of. And I think that's kind of something special about a public school in itself, is that you're bringing kids together, with no rhyme or reason, just, based on the area that you live. And it doesn't matter, like, let's say, well, yes, we live in Collier County and Gulf Coast High School was relatively wealthy. There were still students that went to Gulf Coast that were from, other areas that, are not close to where I live. And so I think that's really important. And I think that's why public schools in particular should be praised for that, as opposed to private schools.
No, 100%. This is, I've gone to public school my entire life up until college, and then now go to a private school. And I kind of wanted to touch on the, I completely agree that like, going to the private school that I go to is completely like I've met so many different people of so many different branches of life, purely because it's a private school. It's not primarily people from the state that it's in. It's people from all over. I have multiple friends who are international students who have lived like all over the world. And it's really great to see. But I completely agree with like the whole public school mentality, and like the bringing of a community is so much more important than it is to just like pay for your kid to get like a really strong education up until high school. I firmly believe that majority of kids should do public school to be able to experience that community, and then allow themselves to make the choice on what they would like to do further beyond that.
Well, and I also feel like college, private, and public schools, like it's a different.
It's so vastly different.
It's different than like the divide between like public high school, public elementary school, like those are way different institutions, because you're paying for college regardless, whether it's public or private.
Yeah.
So that aspect kind of falls away. But when you look at, you know, like the comparison between like community school, and then like Gulf Coast High School, it's like there's a certain type of kid that goes to community school, and a certain type of family that can pay for their kids to go there. And it's not a bad thing, but you're definitely taking away a certain perspective for your kid when you put them in an environment like that.
Yeah.
So.
Great. Last thing that I want to touch on is a debate that recently popped up earlier this year. Florida legislation, brand new enacted bill. It is being called the Don't Say Gay bill. Effectively, let me just say exactly what it states. The Don't Say Gay law states that its purpose is to prohibit classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in certain grade levels or in a specified manner. The specified grade levels, it is talked about, you said perfectly earlier, grades kindergarten through 3rd. And in some places, local legislation have taken it even further to go up in higher grades, or even to prohibit more things from being said. So if a child discloses something to a teacher, the teacher has to go tell the parent. And I think that just perpetuates a really toxic environment, and it makes kids not feel comfortable in a place where they're supposed to feel comfortable. So how do you guys feel about this bill?
I absolutely hate this bill. So deeply. I, being non-binary and being openly queer, it's before I was comfortable with coming out to my family and my parents. School was a place where I could go and I could talk to anyone and I could be myself and just exist. And for a lot of students in much worse situations where I am, who never have the opportunity to safely come out and be themselves amongst family members and community outside of their friends at school, that's their safe space. That's where they can go and exist and not be afraid. And the Don't Say Gay bill completely removes that ability. It also entirely stifles a sexuality is such a, like, from a developmental standpoint, a huge part of childhood, whether you admit it or not. And I think when we state the word sexuality, all of us immediately jump to the idea of sex and sexual intercourse and everything along those lines. And it's a very scary thing for parents to be thinking about, because when you're viewing sexuality, why would you be like, oh my god, why are you teaching or talking about sex with my 3rd or 4th grader? That's not appropriate yet. Where in actuality, it's just, oh, let's have a conversation about gender. Let's talk about why people feel different ways. Let's talk about what's existing. Let's talk about how you feel. And that's just goes back to like diversity and inclusion. Is if you're not talking about something, how are you ever going to know that it's okay to talk about things?
So I, like she said, I hate the Don't Say Gay bill, but I think what needs to be recognized first and foremost is that this bill isn't really about education at all, and it wasn't about school systems. This was a political ploy by what I believe to be like alt-right conservatives to push their rhetorics into the education system and create a new talking point. Because when you look at it, we weren't talking about these things anyway in kindergarten through 3rd grade. I mean, I have been to public school my whole life. I learned about, sexuality and things like that at home with my parents. I learned about it from other kids at school. And, later on in school, I did learn about it from my teachers. It was brought up in certain articles that we would read or, certain topics, but kindergarten through 3rd graders weren't learning about this stuff anyway. And I think that it was really harmful to suggest that they were, and that now it needs to become a political weapon. Because it's not just the Don't Say Gay bill, it's also critical race theory, which are things that we weren't really discussing in schools anyway, but now all of a sudden we've tried to create a weapon out of it to prevent it from being discussed at all, which is much more dangerous than, a teacher's discretion to just not talk about something. Because she said, if you were at school, you could talk about it with your friends, you could go to a certain teacher who you knew you could, express yourself with, but maybe another teacher wasn't explicitly talking about it in class. Now what these bills are doing is preventing discussion on it, period. And it creates, like you said, a very toxic environment for kids in schools where they should feel safe. So to me, things like the Don't Say Gay bill are just very harmful political tools, and they really have nothing to do with the education system and shouldn't have been considered in the first place.
And also, not only is it like students being affected, like you see these teachers that may not be these cis straight whatever, and they can't be themselves in their own classroom where they're supposed to like be comfortable enough to teach students. And like, I identify as a male, but I am openly gay, and I want to go into the education profession, and I originally wanted to teach in Florida. This bill has completely changed my mindset. I've been in panic mode, even though I have like the rest of my school to go through. I don't know if I want to teach in Florida anymore because of this bill. Like, you see, like, I know when we were going through elementary school, we saw teachers and we saw their little billboards with their wife and husband cute wedding photos and these little pictures on their desk. This bill, they can still have their cute wedding photos, but I'm not going to be able to have a picture if I do have a partner, if I get married. I'm not going to be able to picture with me and my husband on my desk. I can't show it.
It needs to be considered that this bill is directly targeting members of the LGBTQ community. And we need to consider that when you're writing something along the lines of, we don't want discussion of sexual orientation, we don't want discussion of gender in classrooms, but are still allowing books in kindergarten about a mom and a dad, and about you're calling your teacher Miss or Mrs. or Mix, or you're referring to students as different genders, you're doing exactly that, but entirely excluding the specific community.
Yeah. I completely agree.
Well, it's also leading to teacher shortages too, things like that, which is like what you said earlier, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, it just leads into the stigma around teaching as a whole. I have heard from countless people that they would be a teacher if the pay was better, if it wasn't as standardized, if they had more freedom and stuff like that. And that just makes me sad, because we could have these amazing people that I know as teachers, but these downfalls that come from our government that don't allow them to teach their full capacity or be granted the amount of pay that I believe they deserve. It's just sad, because now we're seeing places like Golden Gate have teacher shortages, and these kids aren't being granted the same opportunities that I was given with great teachers throughout my schooling. And I think that's just basically sums it all up.
Yeah.
Any last things to say?
No, I don't think so.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you guys so much for having this conversation with me. I had a really good time. I love viewing your guys' perspectives. And thank you, Professor Acevedo, for teaching me all semester. Great professor. I really appreciate it. I gave you a great Gator eval. That's it. Thank you.